Throughout my field placement at the Buckeye Ranch Rosemont Day Treatment Center, I observed the different types of incidents that occurred for the youth we served. By doing so, I also was able to identify the forms of communication and tools used to regulate the student population when displaying negative behaviors. Creating a program to improve regulation through alternative communication is what will be described throughout this presentation. Rosemont is a mental health day treatment program serving youth in grades 3 through 6. The client problem is that they are unable to effectively perform in a typical school setting. This may be due to the fact that they have been expelled, getting out of residential. Many have ongoing patterns of truancy, poor social skills, gaps in education, and aggressive behaviors. The desired outcome for these students is that their treatment goals will be met, which then would lead to a successful discharge and readiness to return to their homeschool setting. For each evaluation question, there is a measurement that focuses on emotional identification, ability to return back to their group after use of the board, and whether the board helps towards decreasing future incident reports. Some of the more common incident reports include being out of bounds, so outside of their assigned area, self-harming, physical aggression, AWOL, behavior acting out, and menacing threats. Rosemont incorporates Bruce Perry's Zones of Regulation into their curriculum, so the youth are already aware of this framework. In creating my program, I incorporated this framework into the emotional identification section. This is the board that I created, so the program intervention. It is typically made for use of nonverbal communication. Everything has Velcro, including the markers, and it's pretty self-sufficient as far as directions go. The regulation board has two main components to it. As seen on the left, there are multiple emotion words paired with an image. They are also organized for which zone they fall into. On the right, there is a selection of different sheets to fill out. Some include a checklist, circling the picture that shows how you feel, and emotions underneath anger. The rationale for my logic model is that when common methods of communication are solely used during periods of negative behaviors, becoming regulated can be aided in the use of providing awareness and implementing extensive methods of communication rather than just verbal. The main rationale for selecting this program is to promote self-sufficiency through identification of needs in an appropriate way. Some systematic reviews to guide this decision include how the use of visuals and narrative are beneficial in reducing anxiety, also how the current practice model, CPS, aids in the development of factors such as emotional regulation and language processing. The outcomes measured would be positive communication of emotions and needs. The qualitative effectiveness includes the interview with the students who use the board to report in on results. As shown, there were 4 different measures used to monitor the outcomes. Reliability focuses on the measurement of the outcomes and seeing if this lined up with the documented data, and validity for those who did not have any incident reports following the use of the board, so the long-term effectiveness does not necessarily mean that due to use of the board, this prevented future incidents. For the board use, as shown, there's movement of the emotion strips, there's fill in the blank, written communication, and nonverbal selections. For the measurement plan, data was collected during hall duty, which is where staff have the responsibility of providing intervention with youth who've left the assigned area, usually due to displaying negative or unexpected behaviors or just refusing to stay and participate. Since this is a time where there would be dysregulation present, I believe this to be the best time to collect data. There were a few issues with data collection, such as being unable to offer the board solely as a nonverbal communication tool because of the risk of students destroying it or being unsafe with objects like the markers. With collecting data, the responses regarding the evaluation questions can be summed up and shown through a 1, which is positive progress, 0, which is no change, or -1, which is negative progress. The evaluation rationale is providing a concrete option where students can communicate their needs and emotions in a safe way that doesn't involve ongoing verbal communication. Some threats to internal validity include not being able to assist students at any time to provide the board, but that was addressed by communicating with staff and students to still have this option. Another threat was that if a client was displaying aggression, the board couldn't be given to them, but this was also communicated with them that if they were willing to display safer behavior, they could use it. And lastly, the board wasn't solely based on nonverbal communication since it couldn't be placed out in the open. So working with this meant having it in a secured area that also gave them their own space. For the data analysis, many interesting points were discovered through the findings, which will be presented in the ongoing slides. As shown in the graph, 90% of the students were able to return to their assigned area after using the board and 10% didn't, so the short-term effectiveness. 100% of the students identified emotions that they were feeling by using the board, and 40% of the students did not have further incident reports after using the board, and 60% did, which is the long-term effectiveness. What's shown here is a highlight towards the creativity and progress that stemmed from the use of the board. It states on the left to draw what's wrong, but the student just decided to write out how he felt without having to follow a specific prompt or outline. And on the right, the student on her own wrote out a personalized list that kind of is like the regulation checklist that's provided as one of the options on the board. Here is another example of how this student made his own list as well and used one of the board components to help identify his emotions, writing out, I'm doing red for my anger and blue for my stress. So circling the emotions in red that line up with the anger that he's feeling, and then blue for the stress that he's feeling. Since there was a student who used the board more than once, I was able to put her data together and see if there was a trend. As shown, there obviously was, where each time she had identified wanting to use the board, ended up changing her behavior to show that she could use it appropriately, and each time was able to return to her group. So this shows how there is motivation to make positive changes, but also due to the lack of the long-term effectiveness, the need for additional help. For the post-evaluation interview, it was identified which parts of the board were most helpful for each student. With BN, he was discharged before being able to interview. And with the movement category, this speaks to the left side of the board with taking off the emotion strips and moving them to the blank space. So what's shown here is a little bit more into the post-evaluation interview that includes some quotes that the students had mentioned. So with RA, like although the long-term effectiveness showed to be ineffective, she was able to complete the board and return to her group. And similar to RA, looking at the response from RS, the board helped to decrease negative behaviors effectively during that moment. Also, what RA stated with I like it with talking to see what happened and get it. This kind of spoke to the processing that we have the students do after they have displayed negative behaviors and made poor choices, and a lot of students struggle with that. and being able to take some accountability. So that's what she was speaking on when describing that. Here is the rest of the post-evaluation interview information. And with each of these students, what's interesting for these three is that their knowledge of what they found helpful or not helpful seemed to line up with their progress. Having a focus that wasn't the normal verbal interaction to try and provide de-escalation seemed to decrease their feelings of anger. Conclusions about the outcomes of the program: there was an overall positive response with identifying emotions while also becoming more familiar with the zones of regulation, since all students were able to identify emotions through the use of the board. It would also be interesting to know for youth who had incidents later in the day if providing the board during those times would be helpful. It's difficult to tell though, because the students here are a very high-risk population who ultimately are triggered easily and have a lower stress tolerance. I was amazed that it wasn't until after collecting data that the board got a little extra design incorporated into it, so torn up. Even with this dilemma though, I used the board in a different way, with a child displaying aggressive behaviors, to ask him to help put it back together. And there wasn't a lot of talking at first. And with the use of scaling, he identified previous anger at a 10 and current anger at a 5. Just after, using different hand pressures to erase the scribbles that were on the different sheets and moving around and organizing the emotion strips seemed to be helpful in regulation as well, even though it wasn't the normal use of the board. Ultimately, I believe that this project highlighted the need for trial and error, flexibility, and creative thinking in social work, especially when working with high-risk populations. Also, sometimes the success can be shown just in knowing additional methods that can be helpful and growing from that.